But I would like to just start today's talk by thanking Anna and Kerry for their generosity and sharing their work with us today and throughout the remote residency. So, and thank you all for coming. We are so excited to share this project with you. So without ado, welcome. My name is Julia Prudhomme. I am the Executive Director of Oxygen Arts Center, joining you virtually from Oxygen, which is located on the traditional territory of the Sinixt people. As an uninvited guest, I honor their ongoing presence on this land. We recognize that the Sinixt Arrow Lakes, Silk, Tanaha, and Yakanuki Lower Kootenai Band peoples are also connected with this land, as are Métis and many diverse Indigenous persons. So yes, thank you for joining us today to celebrate the catalog launch of PALUS, featuring the work of Anna Daedalus and Kerry Davis, which emerged from their remote residency throughout August of this year. It seems like we've gone through quite a lot of changes. We've navigated a pandemic, and we experienced wildfires and smoke during this time. And it was really great to be able to connect with Anna and Kerry throughout all these wild things going on, and really get a chance to learn more about their work and work on the project. The catalog, which will be available in print and is available online on our website digitally for anyone to look at, also includes commissioned text by Rachel Laffo, Andrew Emlyn, and Robert Michael Pyle, in addition to documentation of Daedalus and Davis's work. This is actually the cover, the front cover of the catalog. I also want to extend some thank yous to the artists and contributors, and as well as our designer, Kiko Lehem, our printers, Hall Printing, and our literary arts coordinator, Greta Hamilton, who's navigating us today for making this project come together in such a beautiful way. I am going to go through a few housekeeping details, and then I'll turn over the space to Anna and Kerry. We do ask that you remain muted throughout the discussion, and then we will have a Q&A period afterwards where you can either put your name in the chat if you want to ask a question, or you can raise your hand by using the little reactions button on the lower bar of your Zoom. And then we also have closed captioning enabled for folks. If you'd like to utilize that function, you can, again, hover your mouse along the bottom of the Zoom screen, and that is this little CC button, and you'll be able to follow along with our audio that way. This event will be recorded and posted on Oxygen's YouTube account for folks that were unable to attend, and you'll be able to access that on our website as well. And without further ado, I have the privilege of introducing artists Anna Daedalus and Kerry Davis. Anna and Kerry are a married artist team whose multidisciplinary individual and collective work spans photography, installation, assemblage, and book arts. Their 4 major projects have focused on themes of interdependence, environmental crisis and resilience, the Anthropocene epoch, and geologic time. Their work often employs alternative photographic techniques to foreground physical, tactile experience and the ideas of presence and immediacy. Davis studied photography and filmmaking at Portland State University and Oregon College of Art and Craft. Daedalus earned her BA from Reed College. Their collaborative projects have been supported by grants from the Regional Arts and Culture Council and shown regionally, including Portland State University's Littman Gallery and Southern Oregon University's Schneider Museum of Art. Their individual work has been featured in numerous publications and exhibited throughout the Pacific Northwest. Co-founders of Roll Up Gallery, an erstwhile contemporary exhibition space in Portland, the team lives and works in Southwest Washington State near the mouth of the Columbia River. Conceived under the title PALUS, the Latin word for marsh or swamp, the Residency is a continuation of their work with the Columbia River through alternative photographic processes, plant-based anthotypes, constructions, and time-based installations. These material explorations, alongside the artist's reflections on the process, are included in an artist monograph published by Oxygen Art Center. And so I would like to turn it over to Anna and Kerry. Welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia. So we want to acknowledge that the Sitka spruce. I'm getting an echo. Okay, we'll try it again. We want to acknowledge that the Sitka spruce swamp featured in this project. Can other people hear the echo, or is it just me?
I think I resolved it.
Okay.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone.
No, it's fine. Featured in the project rests on the unceded lands of the Chinook Nation. What we now call Grays River and Wahkiakum County are the ancestral lands of the 5 westernmost tribes of Chinookan peoples: the Lower Chinook, Clatsop, Willapa, Wahkiakum, Cathlamet, and many other tribes who made their homes along the lower Columbia River. As settlers and guests, we recognize the strong and diverse Native communities in our region today, from tribes both local and distant, and offer respect and gratitude for their stewardship of these lands, past, present, and future.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. It's great to see everybody. We really like to take the time to thank the Oxygen Art Center, especially our hosts, Julia Prudhomme and Greta Hamilton, for all of their work, flexibility, and support throughout the project. We couldn't have done it without you guys, so thank you. Our plan here now is to do about a 15-20-minute presentation, about 50 slides, and then we hope you'll hang out and join us for the question and hopefully the answers period after the presentation.
Yeah, so we thought we'd talk a little bit about the genesis of this residency. In 2018, we were invited to the River Arts Symposium at Selkirk College in Castlegar, BC, to speak about our project, Columbia River Shadows. So I think here's a photogram from that series.
So while we were at that symposium, we connected with the regional artists, and through them, we learned about the Oxygen Art Center and their residency program that's located in Nelson, BC. We applied and we were thrilled to be awarded the residency and an exhibit at the center slated to happen this past August of 2021. Our plan was to continue our photogram work close to the source of the Columbia River. Little did we know what would transpire, of course, during these past 3 years. And with the pandemic closing the border in early 2021, Oxygen graciously offered us an opportunity to do a remote residency and a publication in lieu of an exhibition.
During that time, we moved from Portland in 2019 to a rural hamlet on the Grays River, which is a tributary of the Columbia River. Having originally planned a site-specific project on the upper reaches of the Columbia, we were inspired to refocus our remote residency on our local part of the watershed, specifically a Sitka spruce swamp that is directly across the road from us. It's a 55-acre parcel recently restored by the Columbia Land Trust and part of a network of more than 1,600 acres of tidal wetland that the trust has conserved and restored along the Grays River, which is about 20 miles from the Pacific Ocean. Throughout the year and a half prior to starting this project, we had become increasingly fascinated by this very particular ecosystem, observing and photographing the swamp through the seasons and the daily tides. And you've been seeing photos of the swamp through those seasons. We had the opportunity to do when we had the opportunity to do this remote residency, we started thinking of ways to record the subtle movements of the swamp's daily liquid respiration. We took note of the dynamic layers in the swamp of vegetation, mud, water, and the changing light and shadows. One of the things we liked about our earlier projects was, and wanted to incorporate into PALUS, this project, was the fact that we put the materials directly in the water and in the environment to obtain the images. We loved this embodied, hands-on approach and the idea of connecting with the living world in a visceral way. This time, we wanted to open our process beyond photography, and since an exhibit was no longer possible, we actually felt free to work on a larger scale. And this shows kind of a little bit of the expanse of scale that we were working on. We also felt free to work across multiple mediums and over a longer time period. Unlike the photograms we used in our previous projects, we were not limited by the size or light sensitivity of photographic paper, allowing us to work on the land during daylight. One of the many ideas we came up with to respond to the swamp was the idea of using canvas to register the varying levels of the tide, as you can see here, allowing the swamp water to mark the fabric over time.
We started working on the project in earnest in March when we placed our first constructions in various locations in the swamp. They were sort of proof of concept and prototype installations. We found the canvases appealing in multiple ways. They became unique pieces permanently marked by the elements, almost like paintings. And they sometimes registered the ephemeral shadows during the temporary placement in various places throughout the swamp. As we observed the screens, we wanted to formalize the frame in such a way as to have a visual impact and some symbolic meaning. So we redefined the design and placed our second iteration in April, calling it a Torii title screen. And the reason we did this was in Shinto shrines, the Torii gates mark the transition from the mundane to the sacred. And this is important to us because a lot of people, when you think about swamps, they are on the lower end of the landscape hierarchy, both literally and figuratively. The term swamp generally denotes hidden and lurking dangers. You can think about politically Trump talking about draining the swamp. So, and we also feel like swamps have often been considered worthless, both as a landscape and just as land. In our view, the Torii screens merge the mundane and the sacred realms and frame the undervalued swamp as a vital natural space worthy of our admiration. We periodically replaced the canvas screens after they got marked by the water and moved the structure to various locations. We tried to tread lightly as we walked into the swamp. We were lucky to find places where we could access the swamp and place the frames while leaving a very small footprint. We then left the structure in the swamp over weeks and months at a time. The 4-foot by 5-foot screens served as focal points for daily observation. And depending on the placement, the light and other conditions, the screens sometimes fleetingly registered shadows cast by such things as shimmering water or plants growing out of the floating logs, like you can see here.
So not only did we want to record the movement of the water, we also wanted to highlight the plants that thrive in this unique environment. Because it's virtually impossible to walk into the swamp other than those few spots that we found, to be able to really see the vegetation up close, we were always observing it from the edge. And the dense thickets became a wall of green, especially with spring growth. Seeing the fleeting shadows on the Torii screens, we were inspired to create this set, which we've titled Swamp Cinema Shadow Screens, to define this dense swamp vegetation through silhouettes. We suspended, held aloft, and staked variously shaped screens. Here we are employing one of those methods. And then the dog helping on another outing. The screens registered ephemeral images of foxglove, lichen, red osier dogwood, Sitka spruce, alder, willow, fern, goatbeard, and horsetail. This image shows Usnea longissima, or bearded lichen, which grows into long strands and hangs from the Sitka spruce and alder. Extremely sensitive to air quality, its fine, lung-like branching forms seem to breathe in the fog rising from the river and swamp. For this component of the work, we provide the screen and let the swamp project its own film on rare sunny mornings without fog. Here's a sampler showing the various shapes of the swamp cinema shadow screens.
In keeping with the shadow motif, we made a series of anthotypes. An anthotype is an alternative photographic process that uses photosensitive material derived from plants. And this is one of the few times we actually took something from the swamp. We utilized the plants found in and around the swamp, both as the medium and the subject matter.
It's not stuck for everybody.
There we go. Okay, here's a big pile of skunk cabbage that I'm cutting up, and it's going to be squeezed. And here's a skunk cabbage with what they look like in the wetland. And if you've ever been around them, you know why they're called skunk cabbage. However, they're also known by more visually appropriate names, swamp lanterns. We then take the juice that we get from those plants, and we made photosensitive emulsion, which you can see here on as getting the paper coated. We created contact prints by coating the paper and putting it in the sun for hours at a time. So this here is a red elderberry and a horsetail on a skunk cabbage emulsion on a sheet of paper under glass in our garden under the sun. And this is the final result. One thing about anthotypes, though, unfortunately, they will fade over time, especially if they're left out in the light. And you can see one here that's already starting to fade. The fugitive nature of this plant-based medium, in our minds, kind of reflected the impermanence of the seasons and the sort of constantly changing dynamic of the swamp. And here are a couple more examples. On the left, you can see a red twig dogwood branch on a salmonberry emulsion. And on the right, you can see a salmonberry branch with a little salmonberry at the very top on red elderberry emulsion.
In yet another variation on the silhouette theme, we inked and printed found flora and fauna to create a series we've called PALUS prints. This triptych shows a 4-foot-high fern, a cattail, and a lichen-encrusted alder branch. Unlike ephemeral shadows or fugitive anthotypes, these images employ the gyutaku method with permanent inks on Japanese papers. We found this red spotted garter snake, possibly dropped by a bird of prey. It's the only snake that regularly uses Sitka spruce swamps. This is more Usnea longissima and possibly some wolf lichen as well. And finally, the western red alders are ubiquitous here and vital as nitrogen fixers. In the re-emergent swamp, many of them did not survive the transition when the swamp was restored, and they have turned into standing snags and high-rise habitats for woodpeckers and many other bird species.
So over the months of our daily walks and observing the swamp from the vantage of the dike road, we've always been struck by the difference between the pasture on one side, which you can see in this photo is on the left, and the Sitka spruce swamp on the other side. This one dike road encapsulates the entire area's economic and land use history over the last 150 years. After purchasing a defunct dairy farm, the Columbia Land Trust was able to breach a levee, nearby levee, to restore a small part of the swamp that's where we across from where we live, that was once the predominant ecosystem out here. So hoping to and wanting to symbolically reconnect the pasture and the reemergent swamp, we developed this part of the project that we're calling the boundary ribbons. Boundary ribbons are draped across the dike road, and they are 5 foot wide by 6 foot long strips of canvas. 60, sorry. The idea was that the ribbons metaphorically stitch together the swamp and the pasture. Vehicles, people, and wildlife pass by, they leave their traces, and the waters in the ditch and the swamp wicked up on both ends. And to us, to see those ribbons, they evoke the free-flowing water that would be breaching the levee and returning to the river's historic surge plain.
So the project culminates with another related installation that we're calling Surge Plain. After months of replacing the swamp-stained canvases in the Tory title structure, we then took the final 8 canvases and mounted them in simple frames, temporarily siting them in the pasture, as you can see here. Arranged in an undulating line, the grouping faces and dialogues with the boundary ribbons, as well as the swamp beyond. Marking tide levels in a would-be surge plain, the screen's collective palimpsest of layered indexing likewise chronicles half a year of flowing time. So that concludes our discussion, at least of the site-specific work.
So we hope that everybody's enjoyed that quick presentation. We want you all to know that all this work will be presented, like Julia was talking about, in the artist monograph produced by Oxygen Art Center. We also want to take the time to thank the 3 writers who contributed to the publication. We so enjoyed our conversations, our studio visits, and swampside strolls with all 3 of them.
Indeed. Arts writer Rachel Rosenfield LaFoe's challenging questions helped us clarify aspects of the project, and we appreciate her insightful introduction to the monograph. In our discussions with local naturalist, kayak guide, and musician Andrew Emlin, we learned a great deal about the tenacity of slow-growing Sitka spruce in the swamp and about the use of Sitka spruce music wood in instruments. The eminent poet, lepidopterist Robert Michael Pyle, who lives just upriver from us, shared a plethora of plant names and fabulous local lore.
We're grateful for all these dialogues that synergized with our work to deepen our connection with this quietly beautiful place. So thank you.
Thank you. We hope you'll stay for the Q&A discussion.
Bravo.
Bravo. So we're going to hop into the Q&A now, which I will moderate. Thank you so much, Anna and Kerry, for the artist talk. I feel like every time I hear you 2 speak about it, I get something new. And it does give a really good sneak peek into the publication. So just a couple housekeeping bits about the questions. So in the reactions emoji thing, you can raise your hand and I can take questions, or you can write your name in the chat, or you can write your question in the chat and I can read it out for you. So unless there's any burning questions, maybe I'll start with one myself. Unless I'm seeing any hands, no. So I wondered, Anna and Kerry, if you 2 could speak a little bit about how this project changed your relationship to the swamp, and how kind of going and observing it every day with your artist caps on changed your relationship to living there.
It's such a great question. Thank you, Greta.
Go ahead.
Well, I remember one of the things that we talked about early on that we wanted to accomplish with the project was really deepening our relationship to this very particular place, kind of a not a very well-known little corner of the natural world. So I definitely think that that happened. I mean, not only had we spent, so much time walking daily and photographing and observing before we started the project, I think that this really was getting into the landscape more. And we talked this morning actually about this idea that some of the screens and the boundary ribbons, everything in a way was kind of like an extension of us to be really in the space. We couldn't stand in the swamp overnight and watch the tide come in and go out, but the screens could be like our surrogate. So I definitely feel like the relationship was really deepened.
I would just add to that by saying that for me, one of the things that was very apparent was the sense of scale, because we're in a really small, I mean, geographically a tiny little area, but when you take 60-foot long pieces of fabric out into the swamp and they look tiny, or you put these screens out that seem really big in the studio and then you see them out in the natural landscape, it really changes or at least changed my perspective about scale and what it was like to be out in that environment and to be able to see all that. And the other thing I would say is just the interconnectedness of everything. If you read in the publication Robert Michael Pyle's poem, it's basically describing very poetically the food chain that happens in this really diverse and amazing environment. And to be able to be in there and part of that in such a weird way, to be able to document it, was just really enlightening, I think, for me at least, to be able to experience that.
Yeah, I would agree. Absolutely.
So here's a question from the chat from Kurt. You mentioned that the red alders were damaged by the swamp restoration. Could you talk more about changes to the plant community and animal habitat?
Well, we've been learning a lot about that from both Andrew and Robert, who are both naturalists, and from the immense amounts of information on the Columbia Land Trust website, which I highly recommend checking out. I think I have to say, when we first came out here and I saw all these dead snags,
Right.
Standing snags, I actually thought it was a dying landscape as opposed to a re-emerging one. So it's been such a shift in perception to see that in fact it's thriving. And while maybe those, the alder didn't make it, they still are part of a thriving landscape. They're still a very important part. And watching these baby Sitka spruce come up that are, in some cases, they're coming out of nurse logs, and in some cases they've been planted. It's like really dense with willow that I think Columbia Land Trust has planted thousands of willow trees. So I think just even while we've been here, we've watched it become more dense. And so many birds spend, they come and go. I mean, they're migrating birds, but then there are year-round birds. I just saw this morning a great blue heron and a kingfisher, which I see almost every day. Anything that you would add?
I just say that in Andrew's piece, he talks about animals and even plants coming back when these areas are restored. And I always find that an amazing process, because it seems like if given a chance, all the elements of nature will return and they'll repopulate it and they'll make it a healthy environment. And I think that's really what's important about the fact that Columbia Land Trust is out there, even though, again, it's a small scale, it's a start. And the other thing I'll just say is that it's a weird juxtaposition for us, because if we're down in the swamp, we can look out across and we can see all the logging and the clear cuts. And it's unfortunate. I know that there's a lot of arguments can be made on either side of that, but it's difficult to watch that clear cut and at the same time see this re-emergent area, really thriving. So.
Yeah, it's both heartening and frightening sometimes to walk along that road. And what Kerry said earlier about encapsulating the whole land use history in the last 150 years, just that road. It's not just the lowlands, it's the uplands and the clear cuts that we can see from that road too.
So here's a question from Michelle. What was different in the 4 different seasons in terms of the final pieces? Were there significant differences?
Well, we actually worked for 6 months on the project. We had been observing the landscape and waterscape for, a year and a half prior. But I think the biggest difference really for me, we talked about this morning, were the spring tides. The tides are just gargantuan in the spring, and the swamp really fills in, especially at the place that we did so many of the placements of the Tory screen.
Yeah, I would say the biggest difference would be on the screens, because when the water comes up and stays up for a long time, you get different kinds of markings. When the water is low, it doesn't stain the screen quite the same way. So I think that would be the biggest apparent visual difference to me, would be the way the screens looked based on what was happening with the tides.
And then the past year, like, we wouldn't have even been able to do the surge plane installation that we did at the beginning, because there was standing water out there for months. And then finally by August, at the very end, we were able to do that installation. And it was golden with all this grass growing up that Kerry actually went out and he mowed little pathways up to the screens by hand. So yeah, I think that, and the final pieces, like I said, this palimpsest that you see on the screens, that's what changed, is really those markings. They kept getting layered and adding up, and that you see that's just layers and layers and layers of daily tide marking those. So that's what I think was the biggest change in the work.
Here's a question from John. How long has it been since the levees were removed? I remember seeing Oaks Bottom in Portland be reopened to the Willamette River, seeing upland trees drown and swamps slowly redo the vegetation normal to wetlands. At what stage is this swamp in its rebirth?
Early.
Yes, very early.
Very early. I think they took the levee out that affects our swamp, was 2011 or 2012.
Okay.
Was when they took that levee out. And what they do, Columbia Land Trust, when they first started, they were met with a lot of resistance by the local farmers, because this area was settled by the Scandinavians, mostly Finnish people, and there were a lot of dairy farms and dike roads built to make pasture. And at first, when Columbia Land Trust, they've told us, when they first started, there was resistance because it's an economic issue. But once the dairy lands became less viable economically, they saw the value of returning the land, because more fish would come in, more tourists. There were other value systems that were being utilized. And so I think, I'm not sure how long they've been doing it, but they've actually got, from where we live, we're about 2.5 miles from the Columbia River. They have actually been able to purchase almost all the land along the Columbia, on one side of the Columbia, on one side of Grays River, all the way down to the Columbia, which is quite a feat. And I can't remember how many acres, but.
It's over 1,600 acres. Yeah.
And it's recent. It's
very recent. And it's been 20 years that they've been working here in the Grays River area. So it is fascinating to watch the change. We're definitely witnessing it.
Okay, the chat is blowing up with questions. Here's one from Dan. I love the Tory Gate screen photos as a symbolic gateway from the man-made pasture back to a natural state. Was this part of your inspiration for the project?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly right. I mean, we just felt, like I said in the reading, that the idea of a gateway between the mundane and the sacred, not only just in physical terms, but in spiritual terms, and to be able to see it on a longer, bigger plane, so to speak, I think is really what we were going for there. So thank you. Yeah.
From Kurt, were you surprised by how the ribbons looked when you removed them? I think referring to the road ribbons, but maybe also the screens. You could speak to that.
Go ahead.
No, it's fine.
We kind of anticipated that the ribbons over the roads would be marked by, the car tires and other animals. We were hoping there'd be actually more animal life, like actual footprints of, because we have otter and beaver that actually cross those roads all the time, that road out there. And frogs and other things.
newts.
Yeah. So, but yeah, we pretty much got what we wanted. A lot of people drive out, even though it's a dead end road, you would be amazed at how many cars and trucks drive down our little road. And so they did leave their marks on those boundary ribbons. And we were very, I think, happy with how the screens turned out, because when we first started, we weren't really sure whether they would hold the marks and how dark they would get or what they would look like. So, luckily we had a few months to kind of figure out what was going to happen and see. And we were, I think, pleasantly happy and surprised with what happened. So, yeah.
And I think those boundary ribbons, I mean, because there's a ditch on the pasture side, there's water in that ditch, a lot of water in the spring. And through the summer, it dries up more. So I think we had thought that there would be more wicking up on either side. But and that speaks to these seasonal changes in August. There just wasn't as much, but there still was. I mean, there are definitely watermarks on either end. Thanks, Kurt.
So this is sort of question comment. It would be interesting to find out what microorganisms are staining the screens and how many different types of algae and single-celled creatures are layered in the fabric. Do you have a sense of that? Would you ever send them away to be tested? Or
we could. That could be a whole new project. the next iteration. No, that's great. I mean, in fact, we noticed when we were photographing them in the pasture, we said, wait, these are changing. Like, they're continuing to grow. There's all this black mold appearing on these, and it's, there's one that's really swirly, and we said, wait, that one's getting dark. There's all this white space in it. But so and now they're out. It's very, very wet here all winter. So now they're still outside our studio, and they're continuing to grow.
I also think there's a correlation between the water itself, because when the water levels would rise, there would be more particulate matter, whatever it is that's in the water. But sometimes the swamp where we would put the screens would be amazingly clear. And then other times it would be really muddy and full of stuff. And I'm not sure what all that stuff is, but it would be interesting to find out what exactly causes the markings.
We could team up with some other folks around here, some ecologists and biologists, and explore.
Here's a question from Kelly. Did you hear what your neighbors and other drivers thought of the ribbons or the project in general?
You can speak to that.
Well, there's a kind of a funny story about that. So we put the first screen out into this kind of a pond-like area that's right by the road, and people would drive by, and some of our neighbors who live about 1.5 miles from us commented to Anna's dad and said, do you know what these things are? And he said no. And she says, I think maybe the county is putting something out to catch invasive zebra mussels. Invasive, zebra mussels. So the sort of interesting thing was that they immediately assumed that it was something to do with the local authorities, or somehow it was, officially sanctioned project. But then on the other hand, the Columbia Land Trust, they started to see the screens out there, and they were questioning what they were. And they put something up on a chat board at our local Grange, and somebody responded to that chat and told them that
Robert Michael Pyle.
Right, and told them that it was this project we were doing. So it was sort of an interesting thing. Other neighbors were very curious. They would drive by and just ask us, like, what are those? Why are they out there? And we would tell them, and they would be pleasantly surprised and seemed to be okay with the idea. I mean, we didn't have any trouble with anybody at all, and we didn't get any permission from the county or anybody. We just went renegade and just did it. So
now we're definitely the local crazy artists. I mean, people now know about us. So
it's not a bad reputation to have.
Not at all.
Here's another question. Were you worried that somebody would tamper with or steal the ribbons?
I think we did worry about that a little bit. They are driven in with stakes, or they were spikes. It would have been pretty hard. I mean, they could have ripped them out, but we thought we just let that be part of the process. I mean, so much of this was really about the unexpected and not being able to control the process. You know, leaving a lot of it up to chance. So that just would have been, I'm sure we would have incorporated it into the project.
So I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat, but maybe I'll ask another one. Oh, I'll just ask one quickly. Where do you see this project going, or how do you see this land-based and process-based work kind of taking you in your next project?
That's a very good idea. Do you have some thoughts on that? It's funny, you know, I think that oftentimes right after you finished a project, you need a little bit of a fallow period. And we're definitely going into a fallow period out in the landscape, although it's interesting, you know, there's always stuff going on out there. It's always thriving, even when it looks like it's sleeping. But I think that we'll go into a time of reflection and cogitation and then cook something up. And we don't work exclusively collaboratively all the time. We have our own practices. So yeah, I think working on the land and outside was really rewarding. I'd like to do more.
Yeah. The thing that was interesting with this project is that some of the pieces could be shown in an exhibit somewhere in a gallery, like the screens, but a lot of it was more about the documentation, and some of it was just really fleeting, like the cinema screens, you know, those are just up and then we photograph them. So yeah, I don't know what we would do with this work if we were to do an exhibit, exactly how that would work. We'd be open to that idea, but I don't know how we would put that together exactly. But
yeah,
maybe do some more work around that.
And our projects are always so radically different from one another. There are through lines, like shadows have appeared throughout, as Rachel observed in her introduction to the monograph, but they are always really different from one another. So I think whatever we do next, it'll probably be pretty different.
Here's a funny comment, and I'll shimmy it into a question for you from Rachel. When I saw the ribbons across the road, I made a visual connection to Abbey Road. I was waiting to see the Beatles. But the ribbons were placed in such a human way. It was interesting to think about how the lines read as forms on the road versus all the environmental elements that you were capturing over time. So maybe you could speak to some of the visual and cultural references you were drawing from for this project, or maybe that aspect of your own work on the land as this sort of human process and how the environment was shaping that work. That's two questions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Go for it.
Well, a couple of things come to mind. When we first installed them, and then we did some video documentation driving down the road, especially in the early morning, all those dead standing snags that don't have any branches left on them, they cast these perfect lines across the road. And it was really remarkable because it looked so much like the ribbons themselves. So that's one thing. And that's an organic shape that's still straight, a straight line. But the boundary ribbons, they do stand out because they don't look organic. They're not really waving across the road or, you know, ribboning. They are just kind of stretched straight. So do you want to speak to that? Because that was kind of...
Well, I would say in terms of the idea of Abbey Road or a crosswalk, one of the things that we noticed was that the dike road's there, but most of the wildlife out there kind of either ignores it or maybe even utilizes it. So we would see all the time, we would see otters running across the road, minks, other, you know, wildlife going across the road. So the idea that this road is out there and it's sort of, in my mind, or I'm sure an animal would think, this arbitrarily separating the river from the swamp, from the pasture. it just struck us that, oh, it's like a crosswalk. I mean, it's something that they're connected, even though there's this road in between. So how could we visually show or get that idea across that they should be connected? And then the idea of like stitches, like healing, like somehow, bringing the two together just seemed like an appropriate way to think about that metaphorically in terms of the various angles and the different sides being pulled together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the only other thing I was going to say about that we talked about this morning that I mentioned earlier about this idea of these things being surrogates for ourselves and kind of populating the environment out there, even though we're certainly not, there's no part of us that's 60 foot long. They do feel like an extension of our limbs in a way to kind of, I don't know if this sounds too hokey, but kind of embrace the environment.
Question from Jim. What was the most surprising thing you learned from the project?
Very good question.
What was surprising?
Boy, we're trying to think of questions that people might ask. I didn't think of that one. I think it was what Kerry referred to earlier about everything being so dwarfed. When we were back in the studio building these screens, and I think in one of the slides, Kerry's holding the screen and carrying it into the swamp. I mean, they're big. And in fact, there's one behind us and it's huge. And I mean, we could barely get it through all the doors to bring it in this room to have it behind us. But out there, they just disappear. So there was this kind of paradoxical push-pull between becoming more and more intimate with this environment and it just being this tiny little place in this tiny little county. It's this little swamp, and yet it's huge. And I think that just deepening that awareness of becoming intimate with a space, but still finding it awe-inspiring. I think that was a surprise.
Yeah.
Question from R. Wong. Did you notice if the markings on the title screens would change due to gravity pulling them down?
Yeah, I think that's actually right. I mean, they would get wet in the water, they get heavy. And sometimes the way that we built them is they have long stakes so that we can put them into the mud, into the ground so that they'll stay there. And after a while, with the tide moving in and out, I think that the stakes would get loosened and then they would dip further into the water. And I think that they would start to sag. So sometimes the lines would not be completely straight. When we'd stretch the fabric, I would stretch it like it was a canvas, like I was building, like a canvas for painting, and have it as tight as I could possibly make it. But they still would start to sag over time.
Well, and as you said, it's in mud.
And it's in mud.
And those stakes would sink down, or sometimes one stake would sink down more than the other. And I would say, Kerry, it's not straight anymore. Did we use a level out there? And it's like, well, yeah, but it is a swamp. It's nature. So it's,
Okay, so just to be conscious of time, I might just ask the last 3 questions in the chat here. For the photos using the screens and shadows, how much did you focus or rely on the time of day? And maybe you could just speak to how much the time of day and the light kind of impacted this project.
Oh, good question.
Yeah, it was huge.
Yeah.
That's what it was all about for those, especially those cinema screens. The sun would rise up over the there's a ridge and then the vegetation. And if it wasn't, like Anna would say, if it wasn't a foggy day, if it was sunny, we would be out there, and we would have to be out there early in the morning.
And we'd have like half an hour.
And we'd have about a half an hour before the angle of the sun would be too high and we couldn't get the kind of focus. I mean, we could get shadows, but they would be elongated and they would look odd. They weren't what we wanted. So we were getting up in some cases at, in the summer, like at 4:30 in the morning, anticipating a sunny day and then the fog would roll in. Oh, okay, go back to bed.
Yeah.
You know, or
Well,
whatever.
especially out here, there's
Yeah.
a lot of foggy mornings in the summer, and the Tory screens we were often photographing in the morning
Mhm.
at sunrise with Eastern light, and yeah, there were many mornings where I was hoping for a shadow and I wasn't getting one, but they were almost always interesting. And then it's kind of also interesting to note that then the surge plane installation, that was, we were facing the west for those. So those were often photographed either in the morning with the morning sun coming from the east onto the front, or
Backlit.
by the western setting sun. So absolutely, sun and light and all that was a huge component.
Maybe this is related. Rachel asks, is there an alternative photo or print technique that you tried, but that didn't work for the results that you wanted?
We planned on doing a lot, but
Yeah, we had a whole lot of other ideas that we wanted to try. One of the things we did that didn't really work out was we built a Tory and we put glass in it instead of canvas. And then we were going to take that glass and then push light through it and then see what image we would produce through that. And it just didn't turn out the way that we really wanted it to.
yeah, for a cliche bear process.
Cliche bear is the name of the process. Yeah. So that was one that we thought would be great. And we got it to a point and we messed around with it, but we just weren't happy with how it looked. So.
And we would have had to do a lot more and build like other specialized Tory for that. So maybe that's the answer to Greta's earlier question about what's next is maybe eventually some cliche bear.
So I'll just ask this as the last question, and then we can let everyone know where they can pick up the monograph after. Can you speak to the difference between the accretion and the shadows on the screens? And how does the recorded versus the ephemeral inform your experience of this place?
Well, they're both, it's all important and it's all interrelated, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the shadows, I mean, everything is ephemeral out here. The tide itself, you know, coming and going, and the light, as we noted before. So I think that the registering those shadows was important to speak to that ephemeral quality. And then the markings were important to speak to the time-based process that they would build up and really show these months of daily tides.
I also think having something in place so that you can observe gives you the ability to see the movements and see what happens. I think that it's kind of interesting, that juxtaposition, because on some level, the movements of the swamp and the respiration are very subtle. But then in other ways, it's not so subtle because you obviously can see what's happening. But you have something out there that's like a pole that you can like look at and have that juxtaposition between the movement and something still. And then having it be recorded by excretion and then having like shadows which just come and go, you would have both combination of the ephemeral and the solid like indication. So,
right. I mean,
yeah.
in fact, we talked really early on in the project about maybe just doing something that was like a marker that would just show marks. But then we realized that fabric could accomplish both.
Yeah.
So and all this, as Kerry said, is in the monograph, which is just beautiful and exciting, and it has all this great writing in it. So,
well, thank you so much, Anna and Kerry, for answering so many questions, and thank you to the audience for asking so many questions. Very curious, hungry audience. So Julia just threw in the chat where to purchase the monograph, but maybe I'll turn things back over to you, Anna and Kerry, to any closing remarks, or Julia, if you have any closing remarks.
I don't think so. We're very excited about the publication, and we hope that people will order it, and yeah, so you can find that link Thank you to all of you.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We appreciate it so much.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Anna and Kerry. That was beautiful.